Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the INTP stream. Sorry, just repositioning my microphone. There was a common. So this is another in the series of my government political engineering series, and there was a problem observed, or at least detected, by the founders at the time of the founding with the tyranny of the majority problem. And I've talked about in previous videos how parties exacerbate and exemplify the tyranny of the majority problem. How ultimately parties make it ever more likely that a majority will tyrannize a minority. And this was I'm not going to question the frame of validity of sort of questioning whether or not this is a real problem. I'm going to assume that it is a real problem to advance a conclusion. So let's just assume theoretically that the tyranny of the majority problem is a legitimate one. And how can we optimize, these legal and institutional systems that we have to ward off this particular problem? How might we do that? What's an intelligent way to rejigger or re-engineer the system that we have to deflect this potential problem? Certainly, as I've talked about in a previous video, when groups are attempting to decide how to act, it seems inescapable that we vote on the basis of majority rule, and that when a particular piece of legislation or a particular candidate achieves this majority, then the candidate becomes a winner and the legislation becomes law. And there's really no other way to re-engineer our voting procedures in any other way. We decide on the basis of mathematically, we have to decide on the basis of a majority vote to decide what candidate becomes a winner and what piece of legislation becomes law. Now, all of that seems fairly elementary, but there is a question that naturally arises with any particular position you can take in order to decide whether that position is a good one. You have to engage in a process of negation. You have to debate the validity of the yes against the validity of the no. And when it comes, I guess I had an idea, when it comes to majority rule, and it seems inescapable that when we have to decide, take group action and make group decisions on the basis of majority rule, which is virtually inescapable, we have to also, right, that very dynamic, that basic logistical dynamic essentially creates a world where the tyranny of the majority problem becomes ever more likely, theoretically at least. Now, the whole point of this series is attempting to riddle out and re-engineer and institute different procedures, institutional and legal and political procedures, to counter some of the evils that naturally arise from creating and instituting government and organizing it logistically. So, as the title of this video states, randomized default to minority rule. Okay. I had an idea, or at least I asked myself the question, right? We seem to judge everything on the basis of and take action on the basis of majority rule. What about minority rule? What about minority rule? We have majority rule, a majority rule system to make collective decisions. Why not a minority rule system? Very interesting. It's an interesting question at the very least. And so how do we go about answering that question? I mean, it seems like a stupid question, really. I mean, to use a strong word. Well, and someone would just respond, well, that's not democratic. I mean, at least with majority rule systems, we get closer to a democratic system, right? Because more, it leads us in the direction of more people approving something than less. And with any given collective decision, whether it's the election of a candidate or the passing of a piece of legislation, we adopt this voting procedure, the decisioning procedure. Well, what about minority rule? Why can't we have minority rule? Why do we judge? So we decide who becomes a candidate on the basis of who gets the majority of the votes. Why can't we decide it based on who gets the minority of the votes? We decide whether a piece of legislation becomes law or is at least passed by a majority vote. Why can't we do what gets the most votes or a greater number of votes in proportion? Why can't we decide it on what gets the least number of votes, what gets less votes? Why can't we decide on the basis of minority rule than majority rule? Why can't we have a minority rule? Whoever and whatever gets the least amount of votes or the lesser amount of votes actually wins or becomes law or whatever. Why can't we have that kind of a system? What's wrong with that? Well, I mean, that's it. Again, it seems like a silly question. And it is a silly question. At least it starts off as a silly question. Many good insights come from asking silly questions. So in any case, I had an idea, right? And the founders observed that logistically it's inescapable that we have some sort of tyranny of the majority problem arise, because making collective decisions requires us inherently to decide on the basis of majorities anyway. So it's logistically the tyranny of the majority problem is logistically inescapable in any democratic setting that is in any representative democracy or direct democracy that is logistically possible. It's a necessary evil. But how is there a way that we could institutionally and procedurally counter this tyranny of the majority problem? Well, I mean, I had an idea, and it's just an idea. It's take it with a grain of salt. My idea simply is that we have a procedure of randomized occasional randomized default to minority rule, whether that be in voting on a piece of legislation in Congress, or deciding whether to override a veto, or in electing a candidate. There's a potential, I suppose, out, if you will. There's a potential re-engineering solution that we could institute, which might be called randomized default to minority rule, right? And how it could work is essentially at every vote on a piece of legislation, and every vote that is a part of the process of legislating would be subject to some sort of technological lottery by which we have where we make it at least possible that in certain instances of legislation and in certain candidate elections on who should be our elected leaders, presidency, congressmen, or whatever, we have this is the difficulty. There are logistical. It's good theoretically, and I'll explain why. But logistically, it would be difficult to implement. But I could defend a logistical position as well. Okay, so, or at least I'll try to. So randomized default to minority rule, right? So to ward off, the idea is this: to ward off the tyranny of the majority problem, right? Which is inescapable because we take collective action on the basis of majority vote. We occasionally have it be the case that we have a randomized default to minority rule, either when legislating or when electing, such that it's not always the case that majority, right, decides the collective action. It is sometimes, therefore, possibly the case that, and I might explain how this technological lottery might work. It wouldn't be a purely random lottery, because in 9 out of 10 cases, it would most certainly have to be the majority deciding. If it were always random as to whether we default to majority or minority rule, we really couldn't take collective action, because then people will be trying to get the fewer number of votes than the greater. So it really wouldn't result in any collective action, but it could be some sort of constrained technological lottery by which occasionally we have a randomized default to minority rule, either when legislating or when electing representatives. And I'm not exactly sure logistically how this randomized technological lottery would work. Essentially, it would have to occasionally be the case that we default to minority rule, right? So whatever piece of legislation, whatever legislative action gets the lower number of votes, right, is actually the winner, and whatever candidate, gets the lower number of votes is actually the winner, per this logic of the randomized default to minority rule. It really wouldn't be purely random, because you'd have to have this, 9 times out of 10, it would certainly have to be the case that we go on the basis of majority vote and majority rule. But it could be the case that very, very, very occasionally, we somehow have a randomized default to minority rule. And in any given legislative vote, in the process of legislating, or in an election, the process of choosing a candidate. And in this way, we could counter the tyranny of the majority problem that is inescapable because of our need to make collective decisions on the basis of majority vote. We could counter that by having this occasional, very occasional, infinitesimally likely randomized default to minority rule, so that it's not always the majority. This is the point. So that it's not always the majority that decides how we collectively act, who we collectively choose to act on our behalf, and how we collectively act. Under this system, it won't always be the majority that decides. It will occasionally, in a very randomized fashion, be the minority that decides. And that's really the only idea that I have. And well, not the only idea, but you get the point. That's as much as I can say about that particular idea. And I have various ideas attached to that idea, but that's the proposition. It's just sort of a re-engineering solution, and it's theoretically interesting, even if logistically, the way that we design this technological lottery, where we decide, because eventually, there's always individuals act with respect to incentives, political incentives, and if there's always this sort of lurking possibility that the minority actually decides, then we're going to be striving for getting the lesser number of votes than the greater. So there wouldn't be any collective action. So it would 90% of the time, it would need to be the case that we have this, and actually I have conceived the way that we could do this technologically. I just kind of, something vaguely plausible came to me just now, but yeah. And, so 90% of the time, we would have to go with the traditional, collectively acting on the basis of majority vote. But we would have this randomized, very occasional, very, very unlikely loophole or wrench built into that system, where there is this occasional randomized, mostly randomized default to minority rule with respect to any given collective action, whether that be a political election or an act of legislation. So I think it would be interesting. There'd always be this possibility, of course, then, even if we mostly, in most of our voting procedures, decide on the basis of majority rule, we would occasionally have this randomized default to minority rule built into the system, so that we then ward off the tyranny of the majority problem. at least slightly, so that it's not always the majority that decides. It's occasionally the minority that decides. Logistically, and the way that this, I guess, this technological lottery could work, by which we decide whether we default to virtually randomly to minority rule or majority rule, we could have a bunch of whatever given system we're using. We could have, and when we run this particular, so the way that it could work is we've got a system that we, after any given vote is taken, the vote is then passed through. We then use this randomized like computer application or computer software that contains a bunch of yeses and very few nos. And if it contains a bunch of yeses, right, the yes being approving the majority vote, then the majority vote would be approved, and we would just carry forward on the majority vote. But certainly if the system has just a ton of yeses and maybe like a couple nos, it's unlikely, and it's mostly random, but you do have the occasional possibility that that system will render a no, and that no answer, that no rendering, the negative rendering rather than the positive, will then override the majority vote, and we will have a randomized default to the minority vote. And this is just sort of a re-engineering solution to prevent the majority from always winning by this process of randomized default to minority rule. And I don't know why this wasn't thought of by the founders. I think it's mostly because they just didn't have the technology to do something like this in an unbiased and randomized fashion. So I think that's probably why. But we have to update. As new technologies arise, as new levels of knowledge arise, we have to be willing to re-engineer and to update our systems to make them ultimately better, and to incorporate new technology, into this very old process of doing the work of governance. And if we can do that effectively, we could really make a lot of positive changes, both from the perspective of efficiency and ethics. From the perspective of both economics and ethics, we could make a lot of interesting changes that incorporates these new technologies, that ultimately makes our society, more technologically progressive, which I think ultimately is a good thing. So it's just an idea, but maybe others would enjoy this idea as much as I did. And hopefully I've explained the logic of this procedure, of this voting procedure of randomized default to minority rule. And hopefully it's as interesting to the audience as it is to me. So that's all that I wanted to say today. And essentially what this video addresses is it attempts to provide a technological solution to ward off the problem of the tyranny of the majority, which is inescapable logistically because we have to decide on the basis of majority vote. But occasionally, to ward off this problem technologically, we could institute this randomized default to minority rule procedure, where it's actually the minority vote that decides the outcome of an election or the outcome of a legislative process. And in this way, we ensure that the majority doesn't always decide what happens or who wins. We have this loophole, or this wrench, this wrench in the system that would occasionally, through a process of randomized default to minority rule, allow the minority vote to decide. So it's just a solution, a technological solution, to sort of in modernity to ward off this theoretical problem of the tyranny of the majority. Thank you for watching.